Divisi e sparpagliati è la storia del nostro paese. Ringrazio tutti i presenti, mi scuso in anticipo perché al termine della mia introduzione sarò costretto a lasciare questa meravigliosa sala e questo incontro così importante, ma mi capita di dover andare da un'altra parte a essere nuovamente impegnato in una iniziativa. Quindi do inizio ai nostri lavori e dirò qualche piccola parola di apertura, se siamo d'accordo.
Prego.
Ovviamente in inglese, atteso che abbiamo deciso di parlare in questa parola. I wish to welcome Professor White, Professor Fubini, Professor Monacelli, and all those who are attending the fifth lecture, Marco Minghetti, one of the brilliant projects conducted by the Istituto Bruno Leoni, that is a very important institution in spreading the liberal ideas. I was delighted to accept the invitation to hold Lectio Minghetti in the Fondazione Roma, made by Alberto Mingardi, with I have a long-standing cordial relationship based on the mutual esteem. I am a convinced supporter of liberalism, and thanks President of Liberal Party in Italy. We had the strong sentiment of solidarity, social justice, and care for the less fortunate that derive from the Keynesian ideas and the Italian reformist tradition. I appreciated the intense and intelligent educational and scientific activity that the Istituto Bruno de Leoni, which offer an important contribution to understanding the complexity of the current scenario and orienting policymakers' decision. Compared to the theories presented by the exponent of classical liberalism, such the protagonist in my idea, personal idea, Stuart Mill, Keynes, and Beveridge, authors in whom I always refer, the current scenario poses new challenges. Therefore, the theories and the policies must be adapted since something went wrong really. The disruptive and unexpected factor was the finance colonized the economy. Capitalism and democracy, which for years have been the two pillars of development in Western countries, have now gone separate ways. In other words, finance dominates the economies. Finance with an unrecognized external regulatory authority frequently acts in opposition to manufacturing and employment. Confirming the legitimacy of the market economy and without demonizing finance, banks, or globalization, I personally believe that we should return to managerial capitalism, which must become a partner of democracy again. We could then work together in order to create a system which, beside profits for investors, ensure that considerable attention is paid to human and social capital, innovation and culture, and that the less fortunate are protected. I also believe that the role of the state should be confined to dictating to guidelines in the field of defense, foreign affairs, justice, in health and infrastructure, living economies operator, and the civil society, better no-profit organization as Foundation Rome, which I call the third pillar, ample freedom of initiative. The worst sign of state intervention in the pervasive, pointless, and costly bureaucracy, which I free from accountability and has only produces a patronage system inefficient. Bureaucracy in Italy has caused even more damage than in Europe. Also in Europe, deviating from the European Union project envisioned by Spinelli, Adenauer, De Gasperi, and Monnet, and turning to the Union in a costly, pervasive, and enormous administrative apparatus. As a chairman of an old private non-profit institution that, in keeping with the principle of subsidiarity, intends to support the waning welfare state and those of difficulty, I have often closed with bureaucracy, having perceived this paralyzing power. Lots of problems we have every day. When the state has assumed the proper role, according to the Friedman teaching, and the weight of finance has been reduced, the organizations that are truly inspired by the value of solidarity, the dignity of employment, protecting to the loss and vulnerable people, generosity and responsibility must lead the transition towards a new model of democracy that recognizes the freedom and ability to take care of common goods. Professor White, we will now hold his lecture, is amongst the most distinguished academics in the world. Emphasized the shortcomings of whole economy models, their inability to prevent systemic and cyclical crisis, and warned against placing too much trust in central banks' decisions concerning monetary policies. This concept should be at the base of what I find is a proposal for a new liberal economy, to which I believe we should return in order to ensure that in the future generation enjoy the opportunity that I likewise enjoyed as a youth, thanks to these ideas. Thank you for all, and for your kind attention. I shall leave the floor to Professor White.
Thank you very, very much. Thank you, above all, to Professor Emmanuele Emanuele for his very kind hospitality, to the Fondazione Roma for this beautiful setting for this 2015 Lectio Minghetti. Let me just say a few words as an introduction. You all know that under Marco Minghetti as Minister of Finance, Italy attained its balanced budget in 1875. This event was not to be seen with one specific exception in the interwar period, but was not to be seen after that. And as such, we decided with the Istituto Bruno Leoni to celebrate the name of Marco Minghetti by dedicating to its name this annual lecture on public finances theme. Convinced as we were, and I should say as we are, that public finances problem will be with us for the years to come. My feeling is that there will be a significant number of Lectio Minghetti in the future, unfortunately. Apparently, today's lecture, Bill White's lecture, is a deviation from the standard of the previous lectures, in the sense that some of you may think that we'll be talking about monetary policy tonight. This is not exactly, this is not the way we see. Our feeling is that the implication for public finances of what Professor White will say are profound and should be really thought about, so that we are not thinking that we are deviating from the initial, from our initial conviction. William White is chairman of the Economics and Development Review Committee of the OECD since 2009. He was before at the Bank of England and then at the Bank of Canada, where he was deputy governor, special advisor to the Minister of Finance of Canada, and then from 1995 to 2008, head of the Economic and Monetary Department of the Bank of International Settlement. I think, is quite well known for having said and written, unheard, something that was going to happen from 2007 on. So please listen to him quite carefully. William White. Thank you.
Well, let me
Forward and back.
forward.
Forward and back.
Okay. Let me start off by saying how pleased I am to be here, and can I thank the Institute and Alberto Minghetti for having invited me to give this Lectio Minghetti. I think it's not only a pleasure, but it's a privilege, it's an honor. So I thank you very much for that invitation. The ultra easy money experiment. That's what I want to talk about, and as I get closer to the end, we'll start talking about some of the fiscal implications. In effect, I guess what I'm going to say, to summarize very briefly, is that I don't think these policies will work, and I think that they have an awful lot of unintended side effects that in the end threaten to make things worse as opposed to better. But as always, in economics, you know, the two-handed economist, we've got the short-run stuff, and then we've got the longer-run stuff. And the question is, which is it to be? What is the balance to be? Let me sort of take you through this. Let me start with a joke. Perhaps some of you know this. A man is traveling in Ireland, and they have as many little lanes as you have here in Rome, as I've just discovered in the taxi. And the man is totally lost, and he sees an old man in a field, and he says, "How do I get to Dublin from here?" And the old man looks at him and he says, "Well, sir, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here." And that's sort of basically where we're at. This crisis began in 2007, I guess. Some would say 2006. And we basically had subpar growth ever since the whole thing began. Constant predictions, of course, that things were going to get better. I was reminded just the other day that the OECD and the IMF are revising down their forecast for 2016, but it's still going to be better next year than it was last year. This, by the way, is the 7th year in a row that these people have revised down their forecasts. And the Fed and the ECB is no better. There's been a constant process of downward revision. Now, why is that? I think, and this gets you back to the sort of the analytical framework underlying the forecasts, is that all of the models that people use basically assume that we're going back to some form of equilibrium. So that if growth has been slow, it must get stronger. If inflation is too low, it must get higher. We're going back to equilibrium. But I guess the point that I would make, and not at any great length here, is that whole approach really that we've relied on for the last 100 years, if you want to put it that way in terms of macro, basically assumes that the economy is a machine. And you put stuff in at one end, and you get stuff out predictably at the other end. I think there's more and more people, unfortunately maybe not in the central banks, that are becoming increasingly convinced that the economy is not a machine. The economy is a forest. It is a complex, adaptive mechanism. And these complex adaptive systems, which we see everywhere in nature and in society, have got some fundamental characteristics. One of them is they always break down. And they break down according to a power law in terms of the severity of the breakdown. Item number 2, forecasting is effectively impossible. Okay? Even though we try to do it all the time, it is effectively impossible. And the third point to make about these complex adaptive systems is that there is absolutely no relationship between the size of the trigger and the magnitude of the crisis. So the trigger, is it even... People say that it was contagion from the subprime crisis in the United States. Is it plausible that the subprime crisis in the United States could have lasted, now 7 going into its 8th year, and become totally global? Okay? This is not contagion. This was a complex adaptive system that simply broke down. I'm sorry to state, too, that as I look at the world around us, every geographical region looks fragile. And the trigger could come from anywhere. And maybe we can go back to this in question time. Japan, Abenomics, I think it's going to backfire. China is in the middle of a huge transition which may or may not succeed. The United States has now got the lowest participation rate for workers in the Western world. Okay, there's fewer women working in the United States now than in Japan, which is incredible. You look at the commodity producers, they're in big trouble. You look at all the BRICS. Wherever you look, all I'm contending is I don't see stability. I see potential trigger for instability. And our macro ammunition is all gone. Zero interest rates, ultra easy monetary policy, fiscal in many places. I don't have to tell an Italian audience, very little room for maneuver on the fiscal side. So, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. How did we get to where we are? I want to suggest that we have been guided by flawed theory, particularly with respect to monetary policy. The basic idea is that any problem of inadequate demand can be solved by printing the money, and there will be no significant side effects. In effect, this is the proverbial free lunch, and we should get on with it. This theory was first put to the test in the 1970s, and I'm old enough, I was actually around for all of that stuff. The original belief in the 1970s was that monetary expansion and a little more inflation could drive down the unemployment rate and there would be no problem. And then, of course, two things happened. At the level of theory, we had Friedman and Phelps, who came along with the natural rate of unemployment, or the Nehru and all that stuff. And they basically said, it's not true that if you drive down the unemployment rate, the inflation rate will accelerate forever and ever and ever. And then real events in the 1970s proved that was probably true. So that was the first thing that went wrong. Then Paul Volcker came along, remember, in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. And he brought the inflation to a halt. He said it had to stop, and it did stop. He stopped it. But the point is that he was gone by 1986. Okay? So he was not there actually for very long. And then he was replaced by Greenspan. And the Greenspan put in 1987, when the stock exchange started to go off, and interest rates were lowered very, very sharply in order to prevent that from happening and prevent the stock exchange crisis from feeding over to the real side of the economy. And that, I think, in a sense, was the beginning of what I would call unnaturally easy money, starting in 1987. And it was followed by asymmetric policies for 20 years. Now, what I mean by that was every time there was a problem, in 1990, 91, in 1997, in 2001, in 2007, every time there was a problem, the response was the same. And the response was easy money, more credit, more debt, and in the short run, more demand. And what that resulted in was a buildup of record debts and economic imbalances even prior to 2001. And I might just mention, because of your particular interest in fiscal policy, in the same sort of way as monetary policy was asymmetrical, it always eased more in the downturn than it tightened in the upturn. Fiscal policy around the world was exactly the same. So that the fiscal expansion during the downturn was never matched by a comparable increase. And so as the interest rates ratcheted down for over 20 years, the debts, particularly the sovereign debts, ratcheted up for over 20 years. So we've got a problem here of very, very long standing. And let me say a few more words about the last leg of that, subsequent to 2001. The run-up to the crisis. As I've alluded to, I think this crisis that we're living through still, the crisis that we're living through is basically been driven by credit and debt. And there is now a huge literature on this stuff. Sadly, that literature, the modern literature, wasn't there prior to the crisis, although we might then have been warned about the crisis to come. But these kinds of crises have been with us forever. I mean, we had a huge crisis in 1825, another one in 1853, another one in 1874, another one in 1929. I mean, it's extraordinary how many of these things we've had, and they all look essentially the same. They're all basically driven by overly exuberant granting of credit by the banking system. And this one, I think, was exactly the same. These things always begin with some good news. Okay? These things always begin with good news. So you get rational exuberance. Okay? Good news. In this case, my first bullet, it was really the fall of the wall, the Berlin Wall. And what I mean by that was that all of those command and control economies came back into the global financial system. And they put an enormous amount of disinflationary pressure into the system. And in a fiat money system, which is the one we've got, where the banks basically create money, by writing up both sides of the balance sheet, as always happens in the past, the rational exuberance turned into irrational exuberance. And it led to all sorts of increases in debt and other imbalances. Now, what do I mean by that? The debt levels, these are private debt levels, okay, as opposed necessarily to sovereign debt levels. So that was part of the problem as well. But the private sector in particular, in many, many countries, borrowed huge amounts of money and, of course, got the debts to go along with the borrowing. And when you look at the other imbalances, you can see them in sort of various ways leading up to 2007. One of them was asset prices, where equity, etc., basically went through the roof everywhere. Credit spreads went down to virtually nothing. The VIX went down to virtually nothing. Savings rates in the English-speaking countries went to zero or even less, totally abnormal from an historical perspective. All of the external imbalances, the current account, so there's just huge numbers of imbalances growing up. And it wasn't just in the advanced market economies either. I'm still talking now about this 2001 to 2007. Because as the Western economies basically tried to print the money in order to get their economies going, their exchange rates tended to go down. Okay? But the emerging market economies at this point, when confronted with their exchange rates going up, their basic response was to say, if you guys can print the money without limit to get your exchange rates to go down, we can print the money without limit to prevent our exchange rates from going up. And that's precisely what they did. That's precisely what they did. So we had a global liquidity problem even before 2007. And I would note, if that was the character of the global problem, You're all well aware that that's the character of the European problem too, was that there was huge amounts of credit creation, as it were, coming out of the northern banks, being supplied to the peripheral countries, including Italy and Portugal and whatever. And the root of both that global problem and the European problem, I would say, was back again to too much and too imprudent lending. It was an accident waiting to happen. And the problem was that the policymakers all missed it. And we spent 10 years at the BIS talking to people physically, like this, okay? And it went straight over the heads of everybody, okay? Nobody was prepared to listen. Well, why were they not prepared to listen? And what might they have done differently if they had listened? I think they would have gotten away from their false beliefs that I mentioned earlier on. In the end, it all comes back to false beliefs about how things work. And we've got a lot of false beliefs out there. What might policy have done differently? Well, central bankers might have tightened up in response to the credit bubble. But they didn't. And the reason why they didn't was a false belief. They believed that if you had price stability, you couldn't have macroeconomic instability. That's what they believed. And it was a false belief. Financial regulators might have been tougher and more systemic in focus. But their belief, false belief, was that if each independent financial institution was healthy, the system was healthy. But they were not looking at it as a complex, interactive, adaptive system, okay? Which, as I said right at the beginning, can be very unhealthy even if all the bits look very healthy. Okay? So, big mistake. Greater use of macroprudential instruments. I think at the time people weren't thinking about it at all. There wasn't a problem, so there didn't need to be a solution. We may come back to this later on. I think macroprudential, particularly with respect to housing bubbles, may well have a useful future. Lenders, they had a false belief too. The bankers prior to 2007 were making billions, zillions, right? In the U.S., bank profits were 40% of all profits in the United States. Okay? The bankers believed, because they were making so much money, that they were making it because they were smart, not because they were taking risks. Okay? They believed it was alpha when it was really beta. Borrowers were encouraged to believe in regression, not extrapolation. Alan Greenspan telling everybody the United States had never had a nationwide housing bust since the Great Depression. Well, he should have been thinking about maybe we could have a repeat of the Great Depression. False belief. People using their houses, not in Italy, of course, but in many other countries, using their houses as ATMs. Government expenditure caps. Governments were as bad as everybody else. During that bubble, there was so much fiscal drag, so much money coming in, and they all said it's structural. And if it's structural, you can spend it. And they did spend it. And that was a big mistake. And international monetary cooperation, well, there was the false belief that if exchange rates were floating, you couldn't have a problem. There was no need for cooperation. So a whole list of false beliefs that unfortunately are now being put to the test. Crisis in the AMEs is the advanced market economies and the policy response. The basic problem, and I've already alluded to it right at the beginning, is that virtually all of the policies that you can conceive of following have got a short-run impact and a longer-run impact. And the difficulty is the signs are different. Okay? So the short-run effect is positive, but the longer-run effect is not so positive. So when you look at the fiscal expansion, it supports demand. It sure does. And we did it in 2009. But of course, associated with that fiscal expansion is more debt. And as we're aware in Europe, as of 2010, all of a sudden the market said enough is enough. So we have an issue. Support for the financial sector avoids collapse. We did that. I mean, particularly in the United States, but throughout Europe as well. Many banks, semi-nationalized, partially nationalized, whatever. The problem with that is that it sorts out the short-run problem, But now we wind up with banking systems which are even bigger, you know, not just too big to not too big to fail, but too big to save. Right? And the systems have become significantly more consolidated since the crisis than they were before. Support for the industrial sector. Think about the cars for clunkers, okay, and short-term working and all that stuff. Obviously had a big impact short run. It was a good thing to do short run. But longer run, good example, it's left us with a car industry globally that is far too big, and the adjustment in the car industry is still to come. And you could say the same sort of thing with so many different industries that have been allowed to sort of get too big because of the policies that we've been following. And lastly, and this brings me to the guts of the presentation, is ultra-easy monetary policy, which tries to support demand, but it's got unintended consequences. Now, why ultra-easy monetary policy might not stimulate demand? The policy is premised on the belief in short-term Keynesian stimulus, okay? And you'll notice, and I'll come back to this, I've got Keynesian sort of in parentheses, because I don't think Keynes ever said anything remotely like this. But that's what it's premised on, the belief that the short-run monetary stimulus will actually have an effect on demand. I'm not so sure that's true. Item number one is that what has been done in the monetary sphere is so totally unprecedented, and it is totally unprecedented, that I think it smacks of panic, and I think it's led a lot of people to just basically hunker down, you know, and to conserve their liquid assets and basically to just wait. It smells of panic and inadequate reflection. The inadequate reflection, I guess, reflects the fact that if you look at it carefully, what the central bankers have done is they've been quite different, actually, in what they've done. And so what becomes obvious to the thoughtful person is that there's no science out there, okay? People are making it up as they go along. And so the upshot, I think, for a lot of people is, I'm not so sure that we're going to get out of this. Another thing is that the policy signal might not get through. And there, I guess what I think in terms of is the policy rate might come down, but the spreads might widen. The size of the central bank balance sheet might get bigger, but the banks might just sit on those excess reserves as opposed to lending them out. Okay, there's a disruption in the transmission mechanism. We have seen elements of that, but to be honest, in large part, I think the policy signal has gotten through. But then you get on to the next part of it. So the policy signal is there. We've got ultra-easy monetary policy. The spreads are down, the asset prices are up. But the question is, will the spender spend? Right? It's like, what is it, in Faust? There's a Shakespeare's Faust, where I think it's Faust who says, I can call up devils from the darkest deep. And his interlocutor says, well, so can I, and so can any man. But will they come? That's the question. Will people respond to the signal? And I think the answer is there's very good reasons for thinking that people won't. And I won't go into all the details. We could talk about it later. Certainly, the rising level of indebtedness is a real problem, hindering people spending. But I want you to think just a little bit about how the process is supposed to work. Easy money, low interest rates, basically induce people to take spending from the future and bring it into the present. Okay? It's moving forward your spending in time. But if you're moving forward your spending in time, with debt, of course, being the counterpart, at a point when tomorrow becomes today, you've already spent the money. Right? There's an intertemporal allocation here. At a certain point, it's payback time. And that's where we're at 7 years into it. So that's the fundamental reason why I think this thing will not work. Consumers, I'm much struck by the argument that if your roll-up rate, let's say to buy an annuity, is significantly lower because the interest rates are lower, you have to save more, not less, to get to where you want to be in terms of your pension. Investors, there's some stories there. I won't go into them. But let me just say here that in terms of this doubtfulness about whether it will work, the first guy to say, I'm doubtful, was John Maynard Keynes. And in chapter 13 of the General Theory, and this was only 5 years after he'd written the treatise, okay? And the treatise basically said, do all the stuff that Ben Bernanke's just done. 5 years later, John Maynard Keynes said, I don't think it's going to work. And the line said, if we are tempted, this is in chapter 13, that if we are tempted to assert that money is the drink that stimulates the system to activity, we must be sure to remember there are many slips between the cup and the lip. And then he goes on to describe all the ways in which the transmission mechanism won't work. So, unintended consequences. Unintended consequences. These are the longer run things that sort of build up over time. Economists in the course of the last 20 or 30 years, and this is really a flight of hubris, have totally ignored the history of economic thought. And that really is unfortunate. I suggested earlier on that they've also totally ignored economic history because we had all of those crises going back two centuries, and we simply forgot about all of them. Couldn't happen again. We're too smart for them. But the history of economic thought is well worth looking into. Wicksell, 1898. Wicksell said that if you turn to excessive credit and monetary stimulus, it'll wind up in inflation. Hayek in the 1920s said, and that's not all, okay, that if you do that, excessive credit, imprudent credit, you will get misallocations in the real economy. Think about excessive construction, too many container ships, too big retail, too big banks, whatever. You'll get excess capacity, and that will then feed back on productivity. Richard Koo, back in the 1990s, I guess, reflecting on Japan, coined the word balance sheet recession. There's another element of this. You can actually have big debts outside the banking system that really constrain spending going forward. Hyminsky, back in the 30s, basically wrote a book that said stability breeds instability. And when you go back to this literature I was referring to before about complex adaptive systems, you find all sorts of examples of this, that you can have periods of stability that just generate patterns of behavior that then subsequently lead to a great instability. And Shin, this is the last person, he points out the fact that if you have some combination of easy money and growing regulation, that you actually force the system to adapt, because that's what it's good at. You force the system to adapt. And what you wind up with is a shadow banking system, international capital flows that in the end prove to be extremely dangerous. Since 2007, debt levels as a percentage of GDP are up about 17 percentage points. That's for the global economy as a whole. So if you think that we've gone through a period of deleveraging since the crisis began, forget it. It hasn't started yet. We've been going in the opposite direction. And though those problems of debt are significantly bigger today than they were 7 years ago. Zombie companies and banks lowering productivity and potential. I just put it to you, and I think when you look at the NPLs in Italy, and the refusal, as it were, to recognize the NPLs in many other countries, there's a lot of evergreening that's been going on here. The banks at very low interest rates, worried about their own future, zombie banks, won't put their clients out of their misery because they don't know what it will do to themselves. And so you get this evergreening that goes on and on. But as long as you've got these zombie companies competing against companies that might actually have a chance of making some progress, right, you basically impede the creativity, the innovation that leads to increases in productivity. So this is another problem that I can see virtually everywhere. Imprudent behavior further encouraged. There's a lot of zombies out there that will gamble for resurrection. We don't know up until now how bad this problem is. You'll only know it when you see it, okay? But I can tell you that there's stuff going on underneath the surface. Asset prices now are up at levels like 2007. Okay? So they've come back, a bit more sensible in the course of the last few days. But basically, what's happened here is that asset prices have been driven to levels like they were in 2007. Where will we go from here? And lastly, I guess, if most of that stuff I've talked about has really been about the advanced market economies, I want to point out that big implications for the EMEs, that's the emerging market economies as well. Yeah, it's not just what's going on in the advanced market economies. Right after the crisis, 2009, 2010, the emerging market economies were really thought of as a kind of safe haven. And there were huge capital flows going from the advanced market economies into the emerging market economies. Asia is the future. These countries have got no big sovereign debts like you guys have got. So a lot of money went into the emerging market economies. And their response to it, as I said earlier on, was if you can print the money, okay, it was just a repeat of what happened before 2007. If you can print the money without limit, we can print the money without limit. And that's basically what they've done. And in the process of doing that, this kind of semi-fixed exchange rate system globally, particularly with respect to China and the dollar exchange rate system, they basically imported the inflation and the overbuilding and the imbalances more generally that I think earlier characterized the advanced market economies. And in a sense, the process is not very complicated. It's if you've got imbalances at the center, or inflation at the center, but imbalances in particular, and you've got a semi-fixed exchange rate, basically you just wind up importing the problems that were originally at the center. And so now when we look at the emerging market countries, it does seem to me that you can see very clear evidence of the internal vulnerability. I mean, there's been, in China, for example, massive overextension through credit, massive overextension in the steel industry, the aluminum industry, the concrete industry, the container industry. The list just sort of goes on and on. You look at the commodity producers, okay, who expanded enormously under the influence of very low interest rates, and you can borrow the money easily. And now we're all left with huge amounts of excess capacity. These countries, too, the capital outflow, I think in 2015, the Institute for International Finance estimates that the outflow will be of the order of $540 billion. in contrast with inflows of 300 and something billion just 2 years ago. So there's already been huge capital outflows. And we haven't even started to see the implications of tighter rates. You know, what happens when the Fed finally does raise interest rates? And the answer is we don't really know, but I suspect that when we see what happens, we're not going to like it. So these emerging market countries are both internally vulnerable, they're externally exposed, and the turn has already begun. I mean, the outflows have begun, as I've just mentioned. The boom has turned to bust. Brazil is in big trouble. China's in big trouble. Russia's in big trouble. All of these emerging market economies that in 2007 were part of the solution. In 2015, these countries are part of the problem. And so we have a global liquidity issue here now that we have to deal with. Other unwelcome side effects too, and I better be quick about this. All of the stuff I've mentioned up until now is basically talking about macro implications, how the macro situation, the underlying imbalances getting worse in both the advanced market economies and the emerging market economies, okay? It's all macro. But there are other unwelcome side effects as well that people are increasingly focusing on. One of them is it worsens income distribution as the poor and the rich gain at the expense of the middle. The rich, the poor gain if they've got debts and the mortgage rates are very, very low. Okay? That sort of gets them off the hook a bit. The rich gain because they're the ones that own all the risky assets, basically. The equities and whatever, okay, whose prices have been going up. And it's the guys in the middle with whom I would associate myself who don't have the courage to do what the rich folks do, but they've got their money in the bank and they're earning absolutely nothing. So we have an issue here of income distribution that, as you know, is getting a lot of attention in recent years. This is also what's been done here, I think, is a threat to central bank independence. Central banks have done a lot of things with distributional implications, not least of which, think back to the first bullet, okay? Distributional implications are archetypally, quintessentially political. Okay? Income distribution is fundamentally political, and the central banks have gotten into it with both feet. And this is going to come back and haunt them in one form or another. It may be inevitable, but it's going to come back and haunt them. A threat to the solvency of insurance companies and pension funds. You know that in Italy, but it's the same in all the other countries too. I do a certain amount of work for insurance companies, go and talk to them, the future, what's happening. Some of these people are petrified, you know. Their business models cannot survive with interest rates this low. And one answer that you hear repeatedly is we change the business model so we put the risks back on the consumer. You know, we charge more for premia and more deductions. To which my response is, but if to put the risk back on the consumer, that's not really insurance, is it? You know, so there's some deep issues here, and it's the same thing with the pension funds. Perhaps most dangerous of all, the unwelcome side effects, is that the governments start to believe that the central banks have got this thing under control. And as long as they believe the central banks have got it under control, they don't have to do the really tough things that I'll talk about here in the next slide, or maybe it's 2 slides from now. They don't have to do those really tough things. And so just like, as I said earlier on, everybody has false beliefs. They wanted to believe things because it made them feel more comfortable, okay? These were comfortable beliefs, right? Governments are the same as everybody else. They want to believe that the central banks have got it under control. But the central banks haven't got it under control because it's fundamentally a solvency problem, not a liquidity problem. And central banks can't solve solvency problems. So, another one of these false beliefs. And lastly, growing social and political implications. If all that people have got to look forward to is no growth, growing debts, and in the European case, maybe somebody else being the paymaster, this is a recipe for social and political dissolution. And I think all you have to do is look in the newspapers and take a look at the political polarization that's going on everywhere, okay? In Greece, in Portugal, in Spain, maybe somewhat less so in Italy, in France, the National Front, the United States, you know. And in the limit, I mean, there was an article in, Philip Sender had an article in the FT that I thought was absolutely fascinating, talking about the split between the left and the right. And the left are socialists, and the right is all nationalists. And you put the two of them together, and you got the National Socialists. And the precedents for this kind of thing, I think, are really very, very dangerous. And it's also going to be very hard to get out of this. Why is that? The first bullet refers to something that my old colleagues at the Bank for International Settlements call the debt trap, which is if the rates do go back up again, okay, if we do start to exit from all of this, there's going to be a lot of people go bankrupt. And this is going to be a very difficult exit indeed. But by the same token, if they don't raise the interest rates and the debt continues to accumulate, the prospective problem is going to be even worse. And this is what's referred to as the debt trap. I can give you the names of 4 books written in the last year that have all got the word trap in them. Okay? We got ourselves, if I were you, I wouldn't start from here. You got ourselves in a bad place. And that includes many governments. Okay, who are the biggest debtors? And the answer is the governments. So it's a no-brainer to say that the governments are going to try to put pressure on the central banks to keep the rates down until the situation is stabilized. Okay? And when that will be is anybody's guess. Central banks also fear a disruptive transition. Many of the central banks have now got some dodgy stuff on the balance sheet. Less so in Europe, perhaps, than in the United States. But central banks have now got a lot of bad stuff on the balance sheet. And they're going to be very aware that if some of that stuff goes bad and they need to be recapitalized, okay, the governments are going to demand their pound of flesh, okay, in terms of some loss of independence. The central banks are also well aware that if they exit and anything goes wrong, right, they're going to get the blame. They're going to get the blame 100%, okay? Nobody else is going to say, look, it was a complex adaptive system, we got into a bad place, okay? Everybody is going to welcome the opportunity to blame the central bank, and the central banks know that, so they're very, very concerned about it. I think what will happen here, as I said before, who knows about forecasting is very difficult, particularly about the future. I think we can expect financial repression, more use of capital controls, more use of macroprudential instruments. They'll all be described as being done for very good purposes, but in the end there will be a very strong element of financial repression to make sure that the governments can continue to finance themselves. And I think, I'll come to this next, this could lead to either inflation or deflation, or sadly, maybe both. There's a number of, in these complex adaptive systems, as I said before, it's impossible to forecast, but you can give a bunch of scenarios. First scenario is stronger growth and orderly tightening. So let's say the stronger growth in the United States continues, it spreads out to others, things are starting to look a bit better in Europe, And in that situation, all of those sky-high asset prices will start to look as if, well, they got ahead of themselves, but basically the improving economic situation justifies them, okay? So the bond rates can start to go up, the policy rates go up, the other prices adapt, and we basically grow out of it. You can tell that story. The second one says, well, that actually will only happen subject to a number of conditions. There are still a lot of things that can go wrong, even if growth starts to resume. The first thing that could go wrong is that we get a disorderly reaction in the bond markets and in financial markets more generally. And when you think about it, these low interest rates, the whole purpose of them, or at least a big purpose, was to induce investors to go into risky things. That was the purpose of the exercise. So it's not impossible that when the whole thing starts to reverse, everybody heads for the exits at the same time. And this is a stronger growth scenario, suppose we make a mistake, the central banks do, and they wait too long to exit, and inflation really gets started, then that will push up the bond rates even more and exacerbate the problem. So even the good news story is subject to some downside. Weaker growth, that is just if things really do start to weaken off, that is unquestionably a bad outcome. I think it does bring you closer to an Irving Fisher debt deflation kind of world, and that's not going to be very pleasant. Will this wind up in inflation or deflation, or what? The answer is I don't know. I think in the stronger growth thing, you could get more inflation. The weaker growth thing, you could get deflation. The wild card in all of this is nobody's got the slightest idea of where potential is. So, you think about monetary policy carefully calibrating demand and supply. We don't have the slightest idea where potential is in the current economy, in large part because of the crisis, which has caused virtually everybody to mark down their level of potential. But they're all going to say to you, I really have no idea. So we have an issue there as well. The last thing that I would note, and this last bullet, the risks of longer-term hyperinflation. I just finished reading last week Peter Bernholz's book. I don't know if you're familiar with it. I recommend it to you. Peter looks at 29 hyperinflations in the 20th century, and they all have their origins in the same thing. Government's got a big deficit, so it has to borrow. Right? Government's got a big debt, so nobody will lend them the money. And what happens? Then you print the money. And all the talk about central bank independence goes totally out the window. As they know in Latin America, when the guys with guns come at the front door of the building, you're going to do what you're told. And that's the way these things always work. Frankly, there's a few countries that I worry about in that context. Japan is obviously the leading candidate, 250% of GDP. But as we all know, it's a very odd economy. It may well be that the oddness will allow it to get out from underneath this, but they've got a real issue with both deficits and debt. A better way forward, governments with room for maneuver should use it. I would say 5 years into this thing now, it would have been a lot better if we'd got out of it 5 years ago, but we didn't. But we are where we don't want to be. We are where we are. Governments with relative room for maneuver should use it. And frankly, within Europe, I would say that certainly applies to countries with current account surpluses like Germany and Holland. Both public and private investment should be encouraged. I frankly do not understand why people will not do public investment when we desperately need it in virtually every country you can think of, and the interest rates are effectively at zero. I just don't understand it. Private investment is more complicated, but I think to the extent that uncertainty is holding investment back, the sooner policymakers could come out with a clear plan for where we go from here and reduce the uncertainty, the more private investment you would have. I think debt forgiveness and restructuring has got to be used much more aggressively. There's lots of difficulties. I don't deny it, but I think we should be thinking in those terms. And lastly, of course, structural reforms. You know that here in Italy. I don't have to say anything further about that. Supporting growth and also the reduction of international imbalances. You know, if some of the countries like Germany would ease up on the service sector, then maybe they might not have to put so much emphasis on exporting their way to growth. Okay, there's a lot to be done in terms of structural reforms to improve that. The difficulty is that this is a political judgment. What do I know? I don't even know much about economics, as I've discovered. But I think there's little likelihood of this happening. The things that I've just described. International macroeconomic cooperation, you know, those with room for maneuver. Huge resistance everywhere, not least in Germany. Public investment, those high debt levels, people keep coming back to it. You know, I don't understand it, because I think a liability with an asset attached to it is a very different thing from a liability with no asset attached. But somehow that idea just doesn't seem to get through. As for debt reduction, restructuring, technical and moral impediments, the technical one, if the problem is in household debt, as it is in many countries, then you've got millions of people that have to have their debts restructured. Technically, that's tough. The moral impediments, you know, there's strong elements, not only in Europe and a lot of other places, that basically say it's the debtor's duty, his moral imperative, to deal with his problem. Whereas many of us would say, if imprudent lending was associated with imprudent borrowing, surely both of the people have got a responsibility. But this moral thing is deep, eh? I mean, it's interesting that in German, the root for both sin and debt is Schulden. Okay, so it's the same word. And interestingly enough, I won't go into this, in Aramaic, it's the same thing, but that's a different story. And the structural reforms will be resisted by everybody. So I think, and I finish with this, I spoke earlier on about the social and political dimensions of all of this stuff. This quote is from Sir Arthur Salter, 1932, where he was basically saying to the Americans, you've got to give the Germans a break, okay, after the First World War. Debt is an issue, and we have to deal with it. And what he said was, what this apprehensive and defensive world needs now, more than ever, are the attributes it seems for the moment to have abandoned: courage and magnanimity, which is what we need. Why is this not happening? Someone asked Joseph Schumpeter at one point why we didn't get the policies that we really needed. And his answer was politics, politics, politics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to William White for this fascinating talk. Let me assure that this time your talk will not go over everybody's head as it happened in the past. And as usual, we have two discussants. First one is Federico Fubini. Federico Fubini is Deputy Director of the Corriere della Sera. He writes mostly about economics and economic matters. Reading his article is an early morning must. And Federico.
Thank you indeed. I was upgraded by Emmanuele Emanuele. I'm not a professor, nor am I an economist, so I'm not going to pretend to be an economist. I'll try to speak in my own capacity, which is much more like handicraft. And Well, there is a big question here. If you take the central banks of the advanced countries, so the Fed, the Bank of Japan, the Bank of England, the ECB, from the start of this crisis, 2009, I think they have printed something like 10% of world GDP in new money, and they have injected it in the world economy, and still this country, as others, are grappling with the threat of deflation. So there is something that went not quite as expected. The big question is why this wall of money could not lift consumer prices. It probably lifted other prices, asset prices. And I think this is one question that we need to address. We need to address whether the non-conventional monetary policy instruments that have been elected as the ones that central banks have wanted to use are the appropriate ones. And we need to ask ourselves a few serious questions about deflation, I think, now. But this is not what I really wanted to talk about in reaction to this fascinating presentation. First of all, let me apologize. You must have seen me multitasking, but it has to do with something I have to do back in the newsroom at the end of this conference, so I couldn't stop being in touch. I would like to talk about a country you know very well, Italy. I was going through some data that Tommaso Minghetti has gathered, but we know them very well, and in a way we are proud of this set of data. If you take savings, let's say as a percentage of disposable income, you can take it as a percentage of GDP, more or less is the same. Well, Italian household saving as a percentage of disposable income is 870% in 2010. Okay, and this is the highest level you can get in an advanced country. The next country is France, 750, Japan, 740, the UK, Canada, the US. Even Germany does not have, German households don't have that level of savings, including real estate and financial wealth. So why is that? Savings, well, I'm sorry, you're right. So you're right. I'm talking about wealth. Yeah. No, wealth, definitely wealth. You're right. So real estate and financial savings. I consider real estate as part of savings in this case. So why is that? We have a narrative in this country that this is the prowess of our exporting industry and the thriftiness of our households. But then, if you look back at the history of this big ability to save, what we see is that the periods of time when households' wealth increased a lot is not during the best times of Italian GDP growth. It's rather during the bubble times. So I was looking back at those data, and Italy was essentially in line with other advanced countries until up to 1987. The level was around, 280% of GDP in terms of households' wealth. And that was more or less same level as in France, the UK, Germany. 5 or 6 years later, 1992, the level had already increased to 590%. Why is that? A huge current account deficit, huge bubble in public debt, public sector deficits of 10 to 12% of GDP, a very rapid increase in public debt. So the nation as a whole was probably saving or was not saving at all, but households were saving a lot, probably not paying all their due taxes, but saving a lot. Then we had a financial crisis, but still, and this is a difference from other countries, when you're trying to read, for instance, the Japanese bubble of the late 1980s in households' wealth, you see a big increase and then a big decrease. Same thing for US bubbles, big increase and then big decrease. In Italy, it was a big increase, not much decrease later on. And same story, I have to say, during the public debt bubble of the from 2000 to 2007, 2008, big increase up to those levels, and then not much decrease. What happened? Well, the answer to the first phenomenon is Maastricht. The perspective of getting into the euro, what was to be the euro area, performed a miracle for Italy, something that Reinhard and Rogoff would not understand. The point they make in their book is that when you have a default, then you're going to pay higher interest rates for a long period of time. Italy did not perceive itself as defaulting, but in fact had an external default because the Italian government sold its bonds to the international markets based on the commitment to keep the lira in the ERM, and then it devalued by 30%. So from the point of view of the Italian public and the Italian government, that was not a default. From the point of view of an investor sitting abroad and buying those bonds based on a foreign exchange commitment that was relinquished, that was a default. So Italy defaulted, and yet, thanks to the run-up to the euro, ended up having quasi-German interest rates 4 or 5 years later, which is extraordinary, I would say. Something similar, I would argue, is taking place, is happening now. With our huge amount of debt and very poor demographics, very poor average growth rates, I would point out we have the weakest average among advanced economies, the weakest growth rate between 1970 and 2010, very poor demographics, and I would add very poor educational level, which is probably the most important feature in this picture. We paying 1% on 10 years government bond rates, government bonds, and this is I think what explains, thanks to the ECB, of course. And once again, in a way, as Italians, we can consider ourselves lucky. We never pay the full consequences of the bubble we engage in. And those are public sector bubbles, of course. And I could go on and on the social and political consequences of this phenomena, but I would leave it at that for the moment, and I'll give you the floor. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Federico. The floor now goes to Tommaso Monacelli. Tommaso Monacelli is full professor of economics at the Bocconi University. He studied there as well as at New York University. He was assistant professor of economics at Boston College from 1999 to 2002, and thereafter associate professor, and now, as I said, full professor of economics at Bocconi University.
Okay, thank you, and thank you all for still being here. And thanks to the Institute, of course, for inviting me to discuss this lecture, and actually the general topic of the lecture, which is actually fascinating. It's probably revolves around probably one of the most important questions of our times. So I think one of the most important questions of our times is precisely the one that you can see up here. So if I were to ask you, and if I were to ask William White, are interest rates nowadays too high or too low? I think the answer most likely would be that interest rates are too low. Most likely because we have we're in a period of zero interest rates, and so how can it be that interest rates are not too low if they are at zero? Actually, I should say that whatever I'm going to say, whatever comment I'm going to make now is in strong disagreement with what William White has been saying. But I'll try to explain why and try to find a ground of agreement. Okay, so if I ask my students, are interest rates, or if I ask my wife, are interest rates too high or too low? I think it's natural and logic to pose the following question. So, too high or too low relative to what? And so this is how the question should be posed. And of course, establishing what is the benchmark of where interest rates should be. Okay, it's an incredibly difficult task. Okay, so let me show you this picture. So interest rates today are where they are. They are at zero. Okay, so I'm presuming that this is a general feature of Europe, still the US. In many advanced countries, we reached this unprecedented level of zero nominal interest rates. By the way, this picture is taken from a recent study by some Italian economists and some non-Italian economists. The line that you see here, the black line, actually, is where interest rates should be. Okay? So what it means to say that interest rates should be, actually, where they should be, actually, is minus 4%. Let's say now it's 2015. As of now, they should probably be around minus 2%. Okay? Another way of saying what it means that interest rates should be in this negative territory is actually to say that this interest rate, this black line, is where Vixel would like interest rates to be.
Sorry. When you talk about interest rates, you're talking about official rates or market rates?
No. I'm talking about equilibrium real interest rates, where it would be efficient that real interest rates would be, right, if possibly we could go there. This is the efficient rate of interest that a frictionless economy, let's say, the one that Vixel would dream about, right? If only we could go there, this is what efficiency would require. Okay. The problem is that we cannot go there, right? Because we cannot hit we hit the lower bound of zero nominal interest rates, and we cannot actually go into negative territory. So, of course, establishing where interest rates should be, it's a deep and complicated question. This is what models are for. This is what economics is about, right? So this is a study. So these guys use a model, of course, an up-to-date model that of course I cannot explain in detail. But this is what the model predicts. Let's say if you are a physicist, I would say the standard model. Okay, so what people believe that it's a scientific modern apparatus in modern macroeconomics implies that interest rates should be at this level. So of course there are two implications now. If interest rates actually are at the zero bound, it means that interest rates are not too low. Actually, interest rates are too high. Right? Because this is where interest should be. If only we could go there, right? Interest rates should be in negative territory. Efficient monetary policy, optimal monetary policy would prescribe what Vixel would prescribe. So, speaking of the history of economic thought, actually, if you want, this is the Vixelian efficient natural real interest rate. A fundamental principle of good monetary policy, of optimal monetary policy, is that the official interest rate set by a central bank should actually track the efficient or Wickselian natural real interest rate. And this is an estimate out of this model of where the Wickselian or natural or efficient real interest rate is, actually. And this is a picture of the trap that we are living into in our times, is that it's just official interest rates cannot break this negative territory, and they cannot give the economy what the economy is desperately asking, which are deeply negative real interest rates. So that's the liquidity trap. That's the problem of our times. So first question, are interest rates too high or too low? From this more, let's say, scientific perspective, not really artistic perspective, this picture is saying that interest rates are actually too high. And that's why growth is not coming back. Okay. The second question is, of course, and the second interesting point is, why are equilibrium real interest rates or efficient real interest rates so deeply negative? That's the debate about the secular stagnation. Why do we live in times where advanced economies, this is the US, require for efficiency real interest rates to be so deeply negative? Why are the prospects of growth, if you want, so loom, right? That efficiency requires that the equilibrium real interest rates should be negative. So, starting with the premise, right, that we are in deep trouble because monetary policy is too lax, because monetary policy is too easy, in my view, doesn't, stand against a very basic scientific argument that says that actually monetary policy, is actually too tight. The problem is not monetary policy, of course. The problem are the real forces in the economy that require that efficient equilibrium real interest rate be so deeply negative. Okay? And we should be there, we cannot go there. Okay? That's the problem of our times. So if you actually, well, I can skip this. So this is for the time being. This is from 2008, right? You see the crisis, right? Any big crisis, any big slump, any big depression is a fundamental, it's like it's a fundamental force that pushes real interest rates deeply down and possibly into negative territory if the slump and the depression is particularly strong. Okay, monetary policy would like to go there to be efficient. It's just that now we hit this bound of the zero bound. But what about usually? What about other times, right? Because sort of the general premise of today's talk is that we hit the troubles we hit in 2008 because monetary policy, especially in the US, was too lax before. It didn't lean against the wind of the housing bubble from 2000 to 2008, right? So let's look at the more general picture. So the black line is where actually the federal funds rate, the market official policy rate set by the Fed, has been since 1990. You see negative numbers here because this is just in deviations from the mean. And all these measures in blue, in green, and red are all measures of optimal interest rates. Okay? Those are the benchmarks, computed in different ways, according to a rule that Wicksell would love, a Taylor rule. This is for initiated, but just compare the black line since 1990 with the colored lines. Okay, the colored lines is the benchmark, is an estimated level of where interest rates should be if monetary policy was efficient, if monetary policy did its job efficiently. Okay. And again, you see that what actually turned out to be the level of interest rates over time since 1990s tracks pretty well where efficiency would require interest rates to be. So what's the bottom line of what I'm saying is that it's hard. So the story that the trouble we ran into in 2008, the story that we are in deep trouble now because there are possibly unintended consequences of too lax monetary policy, doesn't hold the scrutiny of a more scientific approach. I see merits in this story, but it's just you need a model to beat another model, okay? And what the conclusion of a 15-year research program in macroeconomics has told us is that more or less monetary policy in the U.S., has been behaving relatively efficiently. So, of course, what is the challenge, right? The challenge to turn this argument upside down is to say, look, but you're saying that the efficient interest rate should be in this deeply negative territory, but maybe this is what the model implies, but the model is wrong. The view of the economy is wrong. The apparatus that we use, the lenses that we use to see through how the economy works, which is the model that predicts that interest rate should be into negative territory, maybe that's the wrong part. So now I'm ready to discuss. Okay, so now we can open a discussion of, can you build a framework? Can you build a conceptual model, a conceptual view of how the macroeconomy works that is now able to predict, right, that interest rates optimally should not be negative, but actually, as actually predicted over time, should be now in positive territory. Okay, that's a more scientific approach to monetary policy. But if I hold to the tools of modern macroeconomics and monetary economics, my prediction, or the prediction of these people, which I know and trust, okay, is in 2015, the optimal interest rate should be minus 2.5%. Okay, so we desperately need models that sort of support the story that we have been told today. So we desperately need new macroeconomic models able to tell us that this black line is wrong, that this black line where interest rates should be is actually not into negative territory, it should be in positive territory. So I'm waiting for these models to be born, right? I'm waiting for these predictions, not only to be stories. I wait for these predictions to be grounded in economics. So another way of looking at whether monetary policy was really the devil that generated the crisis in 2008 is scrutinizing the behavior of monetary policy in the US against another benchmark, which is a very easy benchmark, a Taylor rule. John Taylor is a famous macroeconomist who came up with this idea that actually a good benchmark for where interest rates should be is just a simple rule that even my son could compute, right? 1.5 the rate of inflation times plus 1/2 the output gap, that gives you the optimal interest rate. It's an automatic rule. A rule of thumb, but grounded in theory of where monetary policy should set interest rates. So that's the green line. Okay? This is a famous graph that Bernanke put up. And the dashed line is where actual monetary policy, that's reality, right? That's where the dashed black line is where actually interest rates have been in the US since 1995. And you can tell yourself, right? Based on this view, right, you see no trace of monetary policy being too lax or being too tight. In the 2000s, you actually see the actual behavior of monetary policy to pretty well track what a very simple Taylor rule, again, sort of a benchmark for good policy, would predict. Let me say just two final things. Another catastrophic view of the 2000s is that the monetary policy didn't lean against the housing bubble, there was too much credit, that we are running the same risk now. So the red line is percentage change in credit growth to the private sector, right? You see, since the 2000s, this run-up in credit growth in the US economy, which, it's precisely the background of the housing bubble, too much credit, too much money flooding to borrowers. Okay, so if you compare the official behavior of monetary policy measured through the federal funds rate, right? you see that it's precisely in the period where credit growth accelerated the most that actually the Fed started to increase interest rates. So, and that was really the period of the subprime crisis, when credit exploded in the US. We had the subprime shock, and it's hard, that's what I'm saying, it's hard to hold the monetary policy responsible for this, because it was precisely in the period where credit growth accelerated the most that monetary policy became tighter, and actually interest rates, precisely for that reason, were increased in many consecutive times. So now I have to defend my profession. In many circles, the idea is that we had the wrong models in central banks, and economists just had the wrong apparatus, that we have to just to get rid of modern macroeconomics, of all the tools that we developed in the last 15 years. So these guys, again, one of these is a prominent Italian economist, they did this exercise. They said, okay, suppose I was the Federal Reserve in 2008, okay, before the crisis. And I had this standard model that now everybody criticizes, except macroeconomists, okay? And suppose I used this model to predict future events, okay? So they put themselves in the position of saying, what if the Federal Reserve used standard tools, current tools in macroeconomics, to try to predict the Great Recession? Were those tools useful? Would those tools have been useful to forecast the future? Okay, so the black line is what actually happened to output growth in the US, a dip recession, minus 2%, but actually if you're in terms of output gap, an output gap of minus 10%. The red line is where the model, not now, not in 2015, but where the standard model in 2008 predicted that the economy would be in the subsequent years. Okay, so great job. You see, the red line also almost perfectly tracks the contraction in output growth and the contraction in the output gap. So again, it's hard to, so when the proposition whereby we are in deep trouble and whatever happened with the great contraction is because we had the wrong models, it just doesn't hold true. Okay. So let me finish. Good. Of course, because this is not an obvious proposition. So, but I'm not ready to, of course, I'm not ready to say that everything was fine, that everything in the economics profession was fine. So what actually is crucial for these guys to generate this outstanding forecasting performance is to have an ingredient into this machine, this apparatus, into this model, which is a large spike in credit spreads. Okay, this is actually the financial crisis was a large. The symptom of the financial crisis was a large increase in borrowing rates, in credit spreads in financial markets, right, because of the increase in perceived risk. Okay, so the reason this model performs so well in terms of being able to forecast the economy is precisely because these guys inject into this machine, into this model, right, that we robotic macroeconomists use, a large increase in credit spreads exogenously as engineers, right? So the exercise that these guys do is, suppose we have this machine, suppose we inject as an input into this machine a large increase in credit spreads as we observed in the US economy, can we predict what actually happened? The answer is yes. But of course the big pending question remains, which is, can we treat these large spikes in credit spreads, in financial risk, financial perceived risk, as exogenous, right? As just an exogenous input that we input into the machine instead of being able to explain where these increasing credit spreads actually come from, okay? This is where actually I find much more ground of agreement, right? We need models that are actually able to generate large increases in spreads in financial markets as an endogenous outcome of these economic models, not being an input into the machine and then making these exercises to see what happens if I perturb this machine with large increases in credit spreads. Does the machine predict what actually happened? Okay? We need to be able to generate these large increases in spreads in financial markets as we nerdish economists say, endogenous outcomes, right, of and endogenous predictions of the machine, actually. So I had a few slides on. So let me take just 1 minute to show you where I think that we should go, and I think here with William White we could agree upon. What kind of models we need? What kind of macroeconomics we need? What should the profession do to actually improve on our ability to forecast, right? To understand the economy. So let me tell a short story. This is a short. So here you can relax now. So no technicalities and nothing. So. But I want you to go home with this general idea of how the economy works and how we should see and view the economy behaving. So suppose you are a dad, you are a father, you are after a long day of work, you get home, okay? So in a typical household evening, you get a typical shock. Your kid starts crying, normal stuff, okay, happening at home. I'm going to call this a typical shock. Okay, you get home after a long day of work, you are hit by this perturbation, by this sudden event, which is actually of normal size. A typical thing that a kid running around and screaming. Okay, there are two scenarios here. The first scenario, I'm going to call it the tranquil times scenario. Okay, so the kid, you get the shock, the kid is crying. But dad, stays relaxed, no problem. So it's normal times. It's a normal reaction. I don't get actually too much perturbed out of that. But there could be a different scenario, which I call the crisis times, right? Which is the following, right? The kid cries, right, and the father starts snapping at the kid. He starts screaming for some reason. So all of us who have kids that have experienced these moments where it takes just a small maybe cry of the kid to just snap, right? And start shouting at the kid. So notice that I'm injecting into the machine the same shock. The kid is crying in the first scenario. The kid is crying the same size, right? The same loud voice in the second scenario. But very different reactions. In the first case, the dad is just, take it easy. Okay? In the second scenario, the dad just snaps. So what is it that generates these two very different reactions? Okay? So what I'm arguing here is that what generates this very different reaction is the level of stress. Right? Depending on your level of stress that you have accumulated during your workday, the same small shock, typical shock, your baby's crying like he normally does, can generate very different reaction. If you've been having a very stressful day at work, you come back home at evening and you are very stressed, right? You're gonna snap at the kid despite, the kid just crying as he normally does. So what am I trying to say, and I'm finished? So the underlying level of stress is precisely what we should be embedding into macroeconomic models. I'm going to call this financial fragility. And I guess here with William, I'm going to have a lot of ground of agreement. Right? And what our models actually lack, our profession as economists actually lack, is a good modeling of stress. Okay? Stress is something, or in geeky terms, financial fragility is something that accumulates slowly over time. In normal times, when things are actually going well, you don't observe anything wrong happening. But at some point, if the level of financial fragility or debt or leverage accumulates too much, it doesn't take a
a very large shock to generate a big crisis. Precisely like in the kid and father example. The father snaps at the kid not because the kid is crying loud like crazy. The kid is crying as he normally does, but this interacts with the level of stress of the father, which is actually now very high, right? And that's precisely the type of dimension of the economy that probably policy, but not necessarily monetary policy, has been ignoring in the pre-crisis times, right? And this is actually a foundation for why we should have macroprudential policies, in addition to monetary policies or fiscal policies. Macroprudential policies are policies to control the level of stress in the economy. And by level of stress, you should think level of leverage in financial institutions, level of leverage in private households or private firms. Okay, but I think I took too much time, so I'll stop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to Tommaso. Discussants are supposed to discuss it, and they certainly did. I would take, if there are, a couple of questions from the floor. Otherwise, we'll leave the floor to William White for the rejoinder. Any question? That's up to you. William?
Well, certainly the, is that okay? Yeah. The last of the comments that Professor Monacelli made about financial fragility and the need to see this as an important component of what's going wrong. I couldn't agree with more. The BIS has been on about this for the last 15 years without receiving a great deal of take-up on the part of our academic colleagues. I was at a conference. Professor Monacelli has mentioned the scientific approach to modeling. I was at a conference once at the Bank of England a couple of years ago where a proponent of the scientific, the standard model, got into an argument with Charles Goodhart, who was an old friend of mine. And what Charles said I thought was memorable. He said, there is not the slightest thing there's nothing in these models that is of the slightest interest to a central banker. I think it is totally disingenuous to come after the crisis and to put in a bunch of variables that seem to have explanatory power. Fact of the matter is that as of 2008, let's say 2009, there wasn't anybody using the standard model who was capable of forecasting what happened. The IMF, the OECD, they use a very, very wide range of models, the standard models, plus all the big structural models that have been developed over the course of the years. In the spring wheel of 2008, the IMF's forecast for 2009 GDP was plus 3.8 percentage points. It would grow by 3.8%, the advanced market economies. The actual outturn was minus 3.6%. This has got to be the biggest forecasting error in history. And the reason for it was because the fund, and I guess the OECD too, although they're trying to change, was overly influenced by models of the scientific nature that we've just heard. Those models had no banking system, they had no monetary system, they had no credit, they had no stocks, they had no, expectations other than rational expectations. They totally ignored everything that was important.
Can I interject one thing on that? My question was, we heard about credit prices. We haven't heard anything about quantities, amount of credit, and I think this is exactly what was missing from the models.
Oh, absolutely. But and I agree with this last comment. The other side of credit is debt, right? We've got a liability side and we've got an asset side. Now, the fact of the matter is that debt has been accumulating really since the early 1980s, and it continues to accumulate, not only in all the advanced market economies, but the emerging market economies. And debt in the standard model plays absolutely no role. Now, if one wants to say we should introduce debt because debt leads to the nonlinearities exacerbated by financial fragility, I couldn't agree more. But this is all work for the future. All I'm suggesting is the way we look at the way the economy works, it may well be that postulates that begin with the idea of equilibrium, we can still get someplace. Maybe. I mean, maybe we can get to the science of this. My sense of it, frankly, is that we have made a profound ontological error, okay? That is to say, what you can know about a system depends upon the nature of the system. And the nature of the system is so complex that it is impossible to give any kind of reasonable understanding using the kind of standard models that we use. So I say go ahead, try to work, try to make some improvements, but I'm not holding my breath that we're going to get very far. I just want to make one last point here.
Can I
about.
Object? Can I object? So let me.
I would say briefly if possible.
So no, let me just make so let me just clarify what's my proposition. My proposition is not that we should not have credit, we should not build models with financial imperfections with the financial sector. And I'm saying this as a recommendation to the BIS, which I hold in great esteem. I think that all the stories are plausible. They flag a line of warning, and that's absolutely important. But what precisely should be done is to show the following, that in a more quantitative and clear way, that if I embed all these elements, banks, the financial sector, whatever the BIS deem as important, and I strongly agree with that, that you can revert the picture that I showed you. So that's the scientific standard that the BIS should be held upon to. So, which is, we want to be credible in what fully credible in what we claim, which I think it's not far from reality. Is that okay? So now we're going to show you that if we embed all the elements of the economy we believe are important, the prescribed, efficient, optimal interest rate in the economy should be positive. If I see that picture coming out of a model engineered by the BIS, now I'm on board.
Yeah. Okay. Could I just say that this reference to VIXL, okay, VIXL has become very fashionable, okay? But the point I want to make is that the Vixelian model is primarily a one-period model. And the reason why we've got saving greater than investment right now in that one-period model, okay, is essentially because investment was greater than saving beforehand. So when you start saying we have a problem, the natural rate is now negative, I would agree that the natural rate at the moment, the short run, I don't want to get too technical here, but the short run natural rate, which is the expected rate of profit on capital over the sort of foreseeable future, it is negative, okay? But the question is, how did it get to be negative, and why does it stay negative? Sure. And I don't think you can't deal with that problem simply by printing the money. You know, that in fact, as far as I'm concerned, is what's actually making the situation worse. If you look at it from a multi-period perspective, you can't just ignore the future, because what you do today is having this effect in the future, and it's making it worse, not better. So there's some, I think, profound sort of methodological, analytical issues here. And my own feeling is that insofar as the standard model is concerned, we do actually need a revolution. We need a paradigm shift. The difficulty is trying to get one. As Niels Bohr said many years ago with respect to scientific revolutions, progress advances funeral by funeral. And the point is that when people believe stuff, they find it very, very hard to give it up in spite of all the evidence to the contrary. So the standard model, as it then was in 2008, not only did not predict the crisis, the basic nature of the model was that those crises couldn't occur. And yet it did occur, which seems to me to sort of put paid to the usefulness of the models.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the Fondazione Roma for its hospitality, and there is a cocktail out there. Thank you very much again.